Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Lyon, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and to our monthly webinar series, Climate Conversations, Pathways to Action. I'd like to acknowledge that the National Academies Washington, D.C. headquarters are physically housed on the traditional lands of the Nacotchtank, Anacostia, and Piscataway peoples, past and present. We acknowledge that the expertise held by different Indigenous communities is crucial to the work of understanding and addressing climate change. Our conversation today will be recorded and available to view right here after the event. If you'd like to ask questions, please submit them in the Slido box below the video at any time, and we'll incorporate them into the Q&A section of the programming. We also encourage you to participate in the polls that will appear in the same location and to give your feedback after the event in the survey linked above the video. Above, you'll also see a sign up for our weekly newsletter about upcoming events at the academies related to climate. For today's climate conversation, I'm so excited to share that we are collaborating with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences to discuss an incredibly important topic, environmental justice. Both the National Academies and the American Academy recently released reports on decarbonization with sections focused on the equity and justice implications and opportunities of the energy transition. You can find both of these reports linked above. I'm thrilled to introduce Carson Bullock, who will tell you more about the American Academy and introduce our moderator.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carson Bullock, Hellman and Simons Fellow in Science and Technology Policy at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. The American Academy is based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the original homeland of the Massachusetts people. Like the National Academies, we are a member-based organization that convenes experts to tackle contemporary problems for the benefit of the nation. Our work is highly interdisciplinary, and we were pleased to bring together a commission on accelerating climate action with expertise not just from the physical and social sciences, but also the arts, industry, indigenous knowledge, law, national security, youth activism, and faith communities. Environmental justice quickly became a concern at the core of the Commission's work, and it's reflected across their recommendations in Forging Climate Solutions, How to Accelerate Action Across America, their report published last fall. I'm very grateful to be joined today by Dr. Michael Mendez, who will be moderating our conversation. Michael Mendez is an assistant professor of environmental policy and planning at the University of California, Irvine, and visiting scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. His first book, Climate Change from the Streets, was the winner of awards by the International Studies Association and the Association for Humanist Sociology. Michael is a member of the National Academy's Climate Crossroads Advisory Committee and a co-author of the National Academy's Consensus Study Report, Accelerating Decarbonization in the United States, Technology, Policy, and Societal Dimensions. Michael, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the United States or beyond. It's such a pleasure to be here today and have the honor of being the moderator of this innovative and important conversation between two leading legal and academics experts in our country. I've been looking forward to this panel all week, and particularly because we're at a very pivotal point in our country where the climate crisis is ensuing, and individuals at the federal, state, and local level and community level as well are looking for various avenues to address the environmental justice issues, environmental racism at different levels. So today we're going to hear from experts both from a legal, legislative perspective, as well as an academic, policy, and community perspective of how they interpret environmental justice, how it is operationalized at the local level, because there are various definitions and contrasting conceptualizations of environmental justice from a legal, policy, and a community perspective. So we'll dive a little bit more into that of how do you operationalize that? How do we conceptualize environmental justice from those different perspectives? So before we begin this unique conversation, I'd like to introduce our two experts. First is Hillary Tompkins, who is an author of the American Academy Commission on Accelerating Climate Action, which published Forging Climate Solutions, How to Accelerate Action Across America. She currently serves as a partner at Hogan Lovells in Washington, D.C., where her current portfolio includes renewable projects on public lands and waters, representation of Indian tribes and overseeing the firm's pro bono lawyers for a sustainable economy project. She previously served as a solicitor of the United States Department of the Interior and is a member of the Navajo Nation. In particular, I'm eager to learn her expertise from a legal and legislative perspective. Next, we have Patty Romero Lancao, who's a Canadian Excellence and Research Chair at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, and was previously a distinguished research scientist at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Patty examines crucial interactions among people and climate in many cities worldwide. She applies a transdisciplinary lens and community engagement approach to her research on sustainability transitions, bringing social science perspectives to a field traditionally dominated by the natural sciences and engineering. She is also a co-author of the National Academies Accelerating Decarbonization Consensus Study Report. Thank you both for joining us today. As I mentioned earlier, there's many questions about this movement of climate change, environmental justice, and just transitions, but there's various different definitions of that. So I want to delve a little bit more on what brought you to this field, and specifically, how do you conceptualize environmental justice? And just before you answer that, I want to give the policy definition that the US EPA has of environmental justice. According the US EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people regardless of race, color, national origin, or income with respect to development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So a very technical, very policy-oriented or regulatory-oriented type of definition. Like to start first with Hillary from your work. How do you approach environmental justice, and what does it mean to you and the work that you do?
Thank you, Michael, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you and looking forward to this conversation. So it's a really big question, one that has guided me throughout my career. I've been practicing since the late 1990s, and it is something that I think about throughout all of the different stages of my career. And to me, environmental justice is something that, frankly, it's become a little bit more in vogue today. When I started out, it was not something that was really talked about. I was in law school and was really encouraged to work in the environmental natural resources space. I had a lot of great mentors and supportive people in my life at that time that encouraged me to do that because, of course, tribal nations have been affected by environmental policy of the United States for decades and centuries. And in my view, environmental justice is really about ensuring that affected communities are at the table and part of decision making when it comes to implementation of environmental regulations, authorization for new projects, and really has an impactful voice in those conversations. I do think too, environmental justice, just to give you a little bit of background about kind of my career, I've worked a lot in government. I've mostly been in the public sector my whole career until recently, in the last couple of years at Hogan Lovells. And so when I think about environmental justice and what it means, I look at it through kind of a public policy, the government regulatory decision-making role. And through that lens, I really think about power structures and power dynamics. And so to me, environmental justice really gets to that core of who has power, who is making the decisions, how do you get power in that system? How do you have your voice heard and actually have it be incorporated into decisions? And what are those legal structures around making those decisions? So I think that's how I view these questions. And I've really been working, even most recently, about how to give voices to tribal nations in the clean energy transition, how do you work within existing legal frameworks to have those voices heard, and also to work with the private sector, which is new for me, having come from government, and engage with the private sector to raise awareness for these other perspectives, and also work within financial systems as well. So there's many layers to environmental justice, and I'm sure we're going to dig into it a little bit more here.
Hillary, thank you for that opening remarks and the vast experience you have both from government to now private practice, and how it could be quite difficult to create synergies and collaborations around what environmental justice means to very different stakeholders. Thank you for that. Patty, I'd like to ask you the same question, but with a little different take. You've had a lot of experience working with local government as well, providing different types of strategies around equity. You most recently were on a team working with what was called LA 100 or Los Angeles 100, the Los Angeles 100% Renewable Energy Study and Equity Strategies. And the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, recently appointed a new general manager of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. And as many of you may know on this call, LADWP is the largest public utility on mainland United States. So what advice would you give to the new general manager of LADWP on what environmental justice means and equity strategies means from your experience and perspective? You're on mute.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me. I would like to build on what Hillary said. I came to work on issues of justice in general, because since I was working in Mexico, I noticed that community members and decision makers sometimes don't have the capacities, the power, the resources, the income, to achieve their goals, their life goals, and in the case of city officials, their development goals in meaningful ways, in effective ways. Meaning some are more powerful, have more resources than others. So I always have tried to understand how we can connect issues of climate change, which have been at the heart of what I do, with these efforts, with these aspirations. So I have worked on this in Latin America, in Asia, in the US, and now in Canada, and always from the local to the national and international, trying to understand where is that we can get those stepstones, those windows of opportunity to change the configurations of power and the decision-making processes. So what I would tell to this new CEO is that if we really want, if Los Angeles and if other cities want to transition to a cleaner energy system, they need to consider not only the voices of those who are always included in decision-making, such as the private sector or some members of the private sector. Smaller enterprises cannot always have their interests represented. And also underserved communities, people of color, low-income communities. And that means that we need to understand what aspirations and understandings and problems they face, and what solutions they suggest to address the issues. In my work with LA 100 equity strategies, we noticed that community members have a lot of very meaningful and actionable solutions, such as being part of the decision-making process as to how to design policies, how to implement policies, and how to evaluate policies. They know very well their context, and they know that they have historically been disadvantaged by the legacies of practices such as redlining, such as lending, such as renting. And so I would insist in addressing the climate challenges as development challenges, in doing in ways that see community members and many other sectors of the population as sources of knowledge and understanding, and as sources of solutions and actions. By so doing, we can get the buy-in of these communities, and our policies, our interventions, our legislation have more chances to be successful. I know, as Hilary said, that we need to navigate power dynamics, but I am convinced that knowledge is a source of power. And if we are able to work with different sectors and make sure that these different ways of knowing get us say in our understanding of the climate, environmental, sustainability problems and how to solve them, I'm sure we will be more successful. Not because everyone will be pleased, but rather because many will say, well, my voice was not the dominant voice, but I noticed that I was taken care of, I was heard. And I'm able to give up and take something in the process of negotiating the solutions and creating coalitions to negotiate the solutions and implement them and evaluate them.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you definitely bring a unique perspective and a very diverse perspective from the international, national, and local level, particularly on the different data points and different types of knowledges that we can bring to addressing climate change. Because we know that climate change is not going to be solved by just one sector, either the private sector or the scientific community alone. But it needs to include some of the most impacted community, those at the front line of the climate crisis. So I'd like to carry on with this kind of theme of operationalizing environmental justice or equity, particularly both from your backgrounds on the energy sector. Hilary, one area of emphasis in energy decarbonization has been the need to reform how we permit new construction, and especially around interstate power transmission. What are the risks and opportunities, especially with respect to justice, for changing the current regulations on permitting?
Yeah, that's another meaty question that we can have a whole seminar on, right? So I'm seeing this firsthand in my work today, that there are real challenges and need to upgrade the grid to deliver clean power, a need to build out the grid. And we heard recently this week, the Biden administration announced a new initiative through Department of Energy to prioritize this work and to streamline the permitting for this work. Multi-interstate lines go through not only different state jurisdictions, but different tribal lands and then also federal lands. So there is a big push and awareness that this needs to be addressed. And also the United States has made commitments, right, in the Paris Agreement to meet certain clean energy targets. And part of that is building out the grid. And so I think that there's, a lot of interest in how to undertake this work in a way that is respectful of affected communities and tribal nations and local rural towns, and has support from affected states as well. And I really think one of the things that we talked about in our climate advisory group with the Academy was, how do we find those solutions and where you have heard the affected communities directly, and that informs siting decisions, for instance, versus is it the federal government's role? Can Congress kind of dictate these outcomes and kind of apply it universally across the nation? And I think our discussions led us to the conclusion that Congress is in a place where it's very difficult to amend any legislation involving environmental issues. There's also been a little bit of agreement in Congress in the last Fiscal Responsibility Act on the budget. There was an amendment to the National Environmental Policy Act, which is this big federal statute that applies whenever you have federal funding or federal approvals, which transmission lines would inevitably trigger. There was some agreement in Congress about streamlining permitting. They have imposed some now 2-year limits on these kind of federal reviews. So there's been a little bit of movement. But again, this next phase of permitting reform in Congress doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. So getting back to the conversations we had at the academy level, we really talked about the need to engage locally and on a grassroots level and build coalitions in those communities and have conversations about what that particular community wants and do it early before decisions are made on siting and figure out where there can be agreement. Have it be conversations with environmentalists, tribal nations, town mayors, ranchers, the whole diverse communities that are out there, and really try and build that coalition building from the ground up instead of from the top down. So we'd like to keep pursuing those the potential for these opportunities. I think this transmission line announcement by the Biden administration creates that opportunity to go and see where these projects might occur and try and foster those on the ground conversations now as part of kind of building that community and conversations in those places where they are going to be most directly affected and not from DC where I live.
Great. Thank you for that response, and particularly the challenges and obstacles that we face at the federal level, the inertia that's happening, unfortunately, in Washington, D.C. But there are some small wins that can be done administratively through various types of policies, as well as upholding the need to engage at the state and local level and build those coalitions to have real impact. So much of the work that Patty, that you have done, has also been working at various policy scales. I'd like to ask you, how can we ensure existing energy inequities that disproportionately impact low-income populations and communities of color, such as affordability and accessibility to low-carbon technologies, aren't exacerbated during the energy transition?
Thank you. Building on what Hillary said, I mean, I would like to refer to what we did in Los Angeles. When we started, the idea was just to consult communities and, and have a couple of meetings with CBOs representing communities, and then go back, do some modeling and suggest some strategies. And what I did was to reshape the approach. And first of all, by connecting with community members, not with CBOs, because CBOs, as great as they are, do not always know what community members experience, right? So what we did was to operationalize 3 principles of equity, procedural justice by involving communities in understanding during listening sessions, understanding or helping us understand what their aspirations are, how they see themselves in this transition, what barriers they face. How is it that when people tell them, hey, you need solar, they say, well, I rent the unit. I even don't have any decision-making about solar or charging, etc. And if I have the unit, my roofs are old. So I need supports, I need investments. And the area where I live has been neglected historically. So this led us to also understand the importance of recognizing the legacies of past practices and investments. So we also work on understanding those and then coming up with a series of strategies that would allow the city and the utility to operationalize process by not only consulting communities when the utility or the decision maker or the technology developer wants to know, oh, tell me what you think about my idea, but developing a more continuous process that respects the times and that pays for the time of communities. So we dealt with process. We also came up through this collaboration with a series of policies and strategies seeking to address those legacies. And we also suggested ways to operationalize distributional justice, for instance, by suggesting the electrification of transportation corridors along which community members live, or by modernizing, as Hilary said, we need to modernize the grid, and particularly the distribution aspects that particularly affect disadvantaged communities, because we found that they are more likely to experience outage during heat waves, etc. So I strongly, I mean, I think that from the front Hilary is working on, from your front, my mind, from different fronts, we need to change the way we think about connecting with communities. This is not an extractive effort. This is a collaborative effort. And we need, as Hilary so rightly said, it is not only us with beautiful knowledge of everything that will solve the problems. We need to accept that there will be a coalition building effort that is very important. We also need investments and monies, and to have a private sector that is correctly regulated, right? To balance the need to have wins and benefits with the need to serve the public good. And I think that only by working from different fronts will we be able to address this super daunting problem. I don't know, sometimes I go to bed and I say, oh my goodness, this is too much. But the next day I wake up and say, oh no, this is a collective effort. And I'm glad that Hilary mentioned some of the ways. There are many others, but we need to really coordinate them or be aware of each other and really build that momentum that only the organic, emerging, right, and collective coming together of activities can be like part of, you know. And I still don't know the details. I think nobody does, but we have some sense, and I'm really excited to hear Hilary and you, Mike, and I, right, talking about those different fronts and how to create them and build them.
And Mike, could I just chime
Sure.
in on what Patty said? A really great example that is, I think, telling stories about who you are and where you come from is a really great way to connect with whomever you're talking to on a human level. And like, so one of the stories of my tribe, Navajo, is we had coal, right? We had uranium mining, we had coal mining. And when talking and engaging with communities, it's so important to know their history, because that history looms huge in any conversation. And I think for companies, they'll come into those conversations and there's a desire to partner and be good neighbors and do the right thing. But there is that history there that can kind of impede that willingness or openness to trusting and building that partnership. So at Navajo, we had this huge history of mining, and then one of our coal plants got shut down. And now we're looking at renewable energy projects, and we're doing some utility scale projects, solar projects. But meanwhile, still, like, not far from those projects and the original mining sites, there are Navajos today who don't have power, right? They don't have electricity. So it's just kind of illuminating those stories, I think, can really, you know, anyone who hears that thinks that's can't be right, right? And we need to fix that. And private sector folks that I talk with get it. They're like, that's what can we do, right? So I think having those really important conversations to connect people, I find can help kind of provide openings to find solutions.
Yeah. And sorry to come back to you, but we need to break this history of distrust. You know, like community members, different constituencies need to know that we are not only going, in my case as academic, I'm not only coming to extract information and publish beautiful papers, right? I'm coming here to be part of something and bring back to you, and I'm nobody to empower anybody, right? But honor your self-determination, your motivations, etc., your energy, your knowledge. And I think that when people see that you care, that you are listening, couldn't you agree, Hillary? And when you are bringing their stories, their narratives back to address issues, then you really are doing the right thing.
Wonderful. And I really appreciate this connection to history, or from an academic perspective, recognition of justice, and understanding that even before we can engage in this on environmental justice or environmental racism or environmental inequities, we have to understand the history and the historic systemic disinvestment in these communities. And it's, Patty and Hillary, you both mentioned about lack of energy infrastructure, but it's no wonder that many of these communities are at the front lines, first and hardest hit when extreme heat, storm, or other type of climate-induced disaster happens. It's not by accident. It's not a coincidence that some of these communities are first and hardest hit. It's because of historic and systemic withholding of vital infrastructure, other types of resources, and other environmental privileges from these communities. And it just exasperates when we have a rapidly changing climate and environment. So it's important to understand that and acknowledge it and try to rectify it with the local community. And before I go into the next question, I just want to give a reminder to the audience that you can submit questions, and we want your questions and we welcome your questions. We have about 8 or so more minutes of this moderated prepared questions, and then next we're going to be talking directly and answering directly the questions that you submitted. So please submit your questions online. And I'd like to talk a little bit about this idea. We both heard that we both have heard from various organizations, especially from industry, that are interested in environmental justice, but don't know how to implement it or what they're supposed to do. What practical advice, Hillary, first, would you give to an organization that is just starting to incorporate community engagement, particularly the private sector?
Yes, which is something I'm doing 24/7. I think there's so kind of many things that I think the private sector can think about and utilize to really have that good relationship and transparency and real bona fide commitment to engagement. And there's just so many different things. So one is, I think, definitely within their own team, within their own company, it is really important to have people who are familiar with the communities that they are working within. And so that those individuals can help educate others within the company about unique cultural aspects or unique historical aspects, things to be aware of when starting those conversations and relationships. I think that's really, really key. I also think it's really important to understand that because of some of the topics we just talked about, there might not be consent or acceptance or agreement with what the company wants to do. Because it is incredibly difficult for affected communities. And in my world, it's Indian nations, tribal nations, indigenous communities. It just is almost a bridge too far, right? To say yeah, we're okay with this. And I think understanding that setting expectations is really important. And also that it takes a very, very long time, which makes sense, to have kind of real genuine engagement with those communities. It will not happen overnight. The last point I want to make is I do think too it's important to note that I see so many companies that they really do want to engage in a meaningful way and do the right thing, and want to work with tribes in the clean energy transition. Seeing the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides all kinds of tax incentives and financial incentives, and supports to partner with tribes. And I have also seen tribal nations also wanting to explore those economic development opportunities with companies in the clean energy transition. So I have definitely seen that firsthand. I think the challenge has been, how do you then move forward in that potential business relationship? And I do think there is a need in this country to figure out how to provide that technical assistance. A lot of it deals with financial and corporate law questions that tribes, I think, are very interested, some tribes, in exploring those partnerships, but the infrastructure is not there. And so with various folks I'm working with, we've thought about, is there a way to have foundations come into the conversation and provide that technical assistance? Is there a way for law firms to do pro bono work with different types of lawyers that need to be in those conversations to provide that kind of expertise? So what I'm seeing is there is this lack of kind of transfer of that kind of knowledge, which also could involve the return transfer of traditional knowledge from the tribes as well, right? So I'm seeing that. I see the laws are being passed, but I feel like there's this next phase that we as a country need to explore on that front.
No, thank you. And just the complexity there of a relationship building and with private or even with government is moving with the speed of trust. Like you said, it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to, maybe not even in a couple of months, but building that sense of trust, moving with the speed of trust, and really understanding that that this is hard work and hard conversations to have. And on a research that I've done, looking at government agencies that are engaging around environmental justice and land use, I remember interviewing a consultant that was the consultant to a local government around these issues, and really talking about environmental justice first and foremost starts internally. And that is having these hard conversations within staff, within a government agency or even a private agency. And if senior leadership doesn't care about environmental justice, doesn't know what it means, then it's really hard to implement some of these issues. So the education, the community engagement starts within, and really teaching individuals internally first the value of environmental justice and the history and the various avenues, and putting resources and support internally first, and then going from there as well. Patty, I'd like to ask you a similar question, but different. The scientific consensus points to the need to act very rapidly on climate action to prevent the worst of its effects. And some worry that community engagement will slow that process. How can we balance the tension between the needed pace of swift action and the need for long-term relationship building and fair and equitable outcomes?
Well, I'm glad you are mentioning that. In my experience, and based also on what other scholars have studied and done, the idea that we need to act yesterday is misleading. It's misleading because people, everyone, right, when you come with a proposition, will say, okay, what is in for me? How will I benefit? How will this impact my neighborhood, my district? And that requires investment in true collaboration. And what happens is that sometimes the promoters of new projects, particularly big projects, are thinking, you know what, this is a business proposition, guys, you need to accept. And that won't work. I mean, I just give you the example of wind in Mexico, in Tehuantepec. The promoters of wind just came and told community members, guys, we are doing this. We consulted you in a very, we just had a meeting, but we are going for this. And the result was a pushback. No, we are not accepting. And it also resulted in increased distrust in those promoters of those policies and of those efforts. So I think that we need to move with the speed of trust, as you correctly said, and that as urgent as climate change is, precisely because it is a development problem, a political problem, it needs to be addressed with an understanding of the political dimensions and the cultural dimensions, and how people go about risk and risk assessment, and how lack of understanding and lack of trust are key impediments to whatever measure you put in front of me, no matter how well intended. So what I would tell those promoters of these policies is, you need to slow down, as we say in Mexico, slow if you want to be fast. Slow down, listen, do not consult, do not come with cooked things that community members feel are already prepared, already done there. Really listen, open yourself to the needs and to the expectations and perceptions and understandings of those where you are promoting the project. And what is really important, benefit them. Don't see this as only a business proposition. It is also a social proposition. It's also about benefiting those local communities. And in my experience, sometimes the promoters of these big projects do not pay attention to the need to also benefit local communities who end up not having access to water, sanitation, energy, electricity, but are serving the needs of others. So I think that needs to be addressed, meaning there needs to be a balance between the need to get profit, right? Business is business, and the need to also consider societal equity issues. Otherwise, and I keep saying, otherwise we will have another source of polarization, resentment, mobilization, and bad news for decision makers, for policymakers. And really, I mean, I wish it was different, but it's proof in the literature. I did a review for the BETO of this. I came up with numbers, and really the bottom line is, do not go too fast. Listen, you need to listen, and you need to also bring local benefits, not only profits, because if you don't do, you will get in trouble in the short or in the longer term.
Wow, I love two of the key sayings that you said. The first one was slow down if you want to go fast. And then this really idea about outcomes based, or ensuring that you ensure local benefits and not just profits, and moving away from the mentality. So thank you both for these outcomes. So now we're going to go into the interactive process, the submitted audience questions. And the first one comes around this idea of EJ conceptualization. And an audience member asked the following question. As the speakers mentioned at the start of the conversation, EJ work has evolved a great deal, including increasing centrality of climate change to the environmental justice movement, and the fact that climate change has global impacts. How do we conceptualize community and justice now? Who'd like to take that question first?
Hillary.
I know. These are not simple questions.
No, never.
Not at all. I think actually that it's evolving right now. Like, I don't feel like there's a definitive definition. I I think what has changed since I started as a lawyer, over 20 years ago, is that there is a more, I don't know if it's global, but at least in this country, I think there is a greater awareness that there are historical injustices, that there are wounded souls in this country that have not healed. There has been an awakening, I would say, that I've never seen in my lifetime, right? I know as a Native person, I've told people about the living conditions on Indian reservations since I was like a teenager, right? And those statistics are the same. They haven't gotten better in my lifetime. And so I do feel like in my own personal life here in the US, growing up here, I couldn't always feel comfortable talking about that in non-native audiences, right? I do feel like people are listening more to that today. And so this is not a direct answer to the question, but I feel like it's evolving in the sense of there's an understanding that there are different impacts and effects that have happened in different parts of this country that I think is coming to the fore, and that there's an awareness of this. And one of the, again, back to the academy work that I did as a member of the Climate Advisory Board, we had conservatives on that group, liberals, centrists, and it was really interesting to hear someone who's from a different perspective than your own, but saying and recognizing that there is environmental injustice, right, in this country. And different folks from different political spectrums, they might talk about it differently and use different words, but there was a recognition that that injustice exists in this country. And so I mean, I think that is progress, right? And so I think it remains to be seen kind of what are some universal definitions of community injustice. I think people might use different words for those themes. But I think there's an acknowledgement, and there's an acknowledgement that we need to explore how we're doing these things in a different way.
Yes, great response. And we have I'm going to ask a slightly different question, Patty, unless you want to answer this one.
No, it's okay. A different one. I want that the audience also gets.
Okay, great. This is a provocative but very important question. Do either the speakers, and Hillary can also answer this, of course, because it's a very central question. Do either the speakers have a perspective on working with communities who might be overburdened or disappointed by the community listening session process? So I think both of you can answer this.
Yeah, I have many experiences, community members just to give you an example of Los Angeles, but I have many others. Some of them are tired. They keep telling us, you guys come over and over again with new ideas, with new versions of the same thing. We are just tired. When do you come back to present to us? When are you reciprocating? When are you also benefiting us? They are also tired of particularly policymakers coming and saying, now we have this new program. Okay, we are consulting. What do you think? Okay, perfect. We got everything. We have a nice website, but they never follow up with communities. So to that, what I have done, to address that issue the way I can, because everyone knows in this conversation that we are part of organizations, rules of the game, many of which are beyond our control. But what I try to do, and I'm doing, for instance, just now with Los Angeles, is coming back to present to communities and see how we can build momentum around some of the solutions that they suggested that I find very amazing and very important in our efforts to honor the capacities and the self-determination that many groups of the population have, right? Ranging from people of color, low-income people, women, you name it. So that's something I think we need to do to break with this tradition. We need to bring back, we need to see our community members as partners, as equals. So is that enough? I don't know, but we all need to do engage in different efforts to show that we are in this together.
And Hillary, a similar question about this fatigue in participation.
Yeah, which I see all the time, having been in government and my work with tribal nations. So two thoughts. One is really important to have members of the affected communities be able to be advocates for those communities. And in the sense of becoming experts in certain areas that are going to be relevant in this space. If, and of course, I know there's a whole other issue of education inequities, which I don't want to open up a side conversation on, but, I'm again speaking from my own personal experience. I went to school and went to law school and was told by my fellow tribal members, you need to do this for us. This is what you should do. And then I went and worked for the state. I worked for the feds. I'm now in the private sector. This is a lifelong journey for me on behalf of my people. And I elected to go into jobs where we aren't represented. And I am learning throughout this whole process. And, and that knowledge is now, I represent tribal nations. I'm sharing that knowledge with them. I'm working with companies. I'm sharing that knowledge with them, trying to build bridges. It's a very long process, but I think having people who are champions for these issues and storytellers for these issues in many different sectors is really important. So that's one point. The second point I'll make quickly is, again, speaking from my own experience, it is really critical that affected communities engage in key moments, in my opinion. Particularly, I work on the federal level. When big federal projects are being reviewed and approved, there are legal constructs about when you engage and how you engage. And I really strongly encourage affected communities to, if they don't have the expertise in-house, see if they can find the expertise elsewhere. I know funding can be an issue, so I don't want to act like this is easy, but there are key moments when you need to weigh in these agency approval review processes. And if you don't, or if you're not clear, that ship will go by. And so that's something I think that's not talked a lot about. It's not super, it doesn't sound super engaging to have to do that and have that kind of engagement in a very laborious process, right? But it makes a huge difference in terms of, is your voice getting heard? And so that might be more important than having the meeting with the new agency head that's just come in with the new idea that Patty talked about. So.
But I want to say something, Hillary. Yeah. As important as what you said is, in my experience, community members don't feel overwhelmed. They feel they don't have the knowledge. They don't understand those technical things. So what some community members have said to me is that we should rely on their trusted messengers, their leaders, the ones who could have more time, because another thing they have is lack of time. I mean, they come back, they still need to cook, they still need to deal with the children next, So yeah. I think that we need to develop realistic approaches for those voices to be represented and not overwhelmed. Again, by the just one example, in Chile, I had a very nice engagement with a community. I got his leader to be in a meeting with us. He never opened his mouth. I told him why, and he said, "I'm not a PhD. There are these decision makers.
Right.
They are big kahunas. I cannot." So, you know what I mean, Hillary?
That's why I was telling my own story.
Yeah.
I actually think we're making the same point.
But yeah, and I mean, I think Mike and I could also make the case. I like you. I come from very humble origins, and I was forced to, for instance, fetch water. Like going to school was not an easy thing. And I agree with you. We represent that. And our journey is also about representing those voices, but that's not enough. Because I wish, Hillary, we had 100 Hillarys distributed just in DC, but because we don't have them besides you and Mike and me representing those voices, we need to enhance other voices to be there in different parts of the US and of the world, catalyzing change. That was my only point. I was just adding to what you said.
I love it. I get ambassadors, so to speak.
Yes, no, definitely. I commend both of you for the work that you do and the very applied work that you do. It would be very easy for many of you and many of us to, enter into other careers that are quite more lucrative, and be able to have even more spare time. But we choose oftentimes to not only pursue these careers that are stressful, working directly with the community, and because, as you mentioned, there's a need, and increasing representation is quite important, and being able to work with community members that we may have maybe some type of affinity to, and moving away from what we often call in urban planning or public policy, from that DAD model: decide, announce, and defend. And that's what we often see, the DAD model: decide, announce, and defend. And the work that you both are doing are trying to change that process. I guess similarly, in a similar fashion, Hillary, we got a question regarding federal issues. What trends are you seeing in federal agencies as they consider eligible expenses for reimbursement as part of meaningful public involvement?
Yeah, I'm not an authority on this, but I do know that there are grants from DOE in particular, like under the Inflation Reduction Act. The Interior Department, where I used to work, definitely has grant programs to help with technical assistance for tribal nations. And again, that's the world I operate in. EPA as well, I understand, has those types of opportunities to provide that financial support. But again, I think it gets into this issue of filling out the grant applications and understanding, what that entails and how to do a grant application that's going to be successful. And so there again is this recurring theme of building that capacity building in a way that can really help provide those opportunities for engagement. And I think we all just touched on a really important issue that isn't talked a lot about, which is when you come from these communities and you are a spokesperson, a bridge builder, someone who's bringing knowledge to people who might not have that knowledge. It's a lot. It's not just a job, right? Like, we all have our job titles, but there's an additional layer there that you carry. And I like Patty's comment about like having, other supporters and other ambassadors, because that full blown capacity in various areas of expertise, energy, law, finance, grant writing, from those affected communities, it's going to take, decades, century to build that. So that's my long-winded answer to this question. It's an important one, and I think it's a big part of the challenges that are out there.
Thank you for that. Important points of the responsibility, both ethical, morally, that we have, and particularly this idea of reciprocity. You each mentioned this. It's not just whoever you're representing, the organization you're representing, academic, private, local government, is making sure it's not extractive. It's a two-way street as well. Patty, perhaps you have experience at the state and local level of changes in reimbursement or funding for community engagement?
Yes, and I do. I need to say that as beautiful as the idea sounds, it's really hard to implement, not necessarily because some of the sponsors of the work I did when I was at the National Renewable Energy Lab don't want to do it, but because there are institutional constraints, rules of the game. They cannot, for instance, just give money without having without preparing for audits of how they allocate the money. So what we did in our last big effort to support a key player in this, and I won't say the name, what we did was to come with a lot of best practices. We went out and looked into the literature and say, look, this is what you need to do, and it is best practice, and it has been done in the area of health. So we mentioned everything, but I learned the hard way that as well-intended as this entity was, they had constraints. So one thing is to say we need to be equal, we need to hold hands, we need to be happy. And the other is face the fact that no, that we have constraints. Hilary, you know better than I, right? As an expert in legal issues, you can be liable if you just go ahead and, as a sponsor, allocate money without having any way to be within what is accepted in your organization. The good news is that for research, you can allocate money to pay for community members and for CBOs time and knowledge. And for this CERC that I'm leading, we already allocated money so that and I have done that before, believe me, in Mexico, when I used to do it, I laugh now, but I used to bring communities, we could pay for their food, their transportation, and it was literally out of us, right? Our own resources, because in Mexico, honestly, you don't have the level of resources and of wealth that the US has. That said, I am sensing that it is increasingly that many in the US, and I agree with you, Hilary, more and more key decision makers are saying, we want to involve communities, we need to pay for their time, right? We need to compensate them. We want CBOs, we need to compensate them. So I think that this is part of this movement that Hilary mentioned, this movement towards acknowledging that also communities are experts, paying for their time, compensating them, using tribal and indigenous communities' principles of sovereignty when it comes to data, when it comes to, for instance, all the knowledge they have with the use of seeds, with the use of medicine, herbal medicine. I think that the momentum is there, and I'm really happy to be part of it, right? For us to really acknowledge, compensate, turn our partners from all the sectors, private sector, governmental sector, into equals. And particularly for community members, part of that is to pay for their time, to provide them food, to make sure they have a means to go from one place to the other, particularly in areas where access to transport is a constraint, and I have been in those. I'm sure you, Hilary, too, right? So it's getting there, Mike, but there are challenges to face that are so trivial that I didn't discover them till I faced them.
Yeah, and you both bring up important points. There's been changing in our funding streams to allow some of this more robust community engagement. I know a lot of philanthropic organizations, foundations are required in the payment for community engagement, direct payment to NGOs, as well as research grants as well. I think one key example I'd like to mention in the National Academies Accelerating Decarbonization Report, which I believe staff is going to put in the link for everyone, or it's on the website. We highlight in Chapter 2 on energy justice and equity the California example of transformative climate communities. So these are major grants that are given to regions promoting climate justice and climate adaptation and mitigation. And it's been in the hundreds of millions of dollars throughout California. But before you can qualify for those major grants, they provide funding for essentially creating a blueprint, bringing diverse stakeholders together from community-led, and it's largely community-led, but bringing private sector, government, all together, and essentially creating a scoping analysis or blueprint or landscape of what is happening in that region in terms of impacts, inequities, environmental injustice, and what are the priority targeted areas and targeted buckets that are needed to be funded. And so diverse groups, again, from private, government, and most importantly, community come together and create that plan before they're given funding. And it really creates, and it's usually a year process or so, and it creates strong collaboration and hopefully a lot of trust. And it's even been done in conservative agriculture and rural areas like Fresno, which we highlight in the report. So I encourage you to learn a little bit more of that, and it's somewhat be modeled at the federal level for some of the IRA and infrastructure funding that's coming out. So we have one more, we have a time, Polly, for one more quick question, and I'm going to take the prerogative as the moderator to ask both of you, and in on a little different note. So with the climate-induced disasters, the disproportionate impact happening to various communities, there, and particularly with the youth generation, as a professor, I see this a lot. There's this increasing sense of dread, climate anxiety, sense of hopelessness in terms of the climate crisis is too big for them as individuals to have any effective method to contribute to turning the tide. With the work that you both do you approach it with this dread and anxiety? Do you approach it with a sense of hope? What is motivating you to continue this work in light of all the negative stories that we hear in the media, you see personally as well?
Something I do, and I learned to do it by being trained in the IPCC, is to balance the need between saying, yeah, the situation is there, we need to act, with some hope, like with always saying, yeah, this is very terrible. We are moving to another situation, unexpected situation, with an emphasis on what community members, individuals, decision makers, private sector can do. It has been found in the literature that if you overemphasize the negative, people just turn off and say, I cannot do, and they get very depressed. And I personally, sometimes I'm like, oh my goodness. But then I say, no, Patty, remember how privileged you are, right? After growing in a poor neighborhood, now I have the privilege of doing what I do. So on a personal basis, I try to always think of the good in life. But as someone who has worked on climate change issues, I have learned that it is important to balance the need for urgency with the need, with hope, with opening options for people to say, well, there is something I can do for me and for the ones I love. And usually people care for their children and their loved ones.
Thank you. Hillary.
That's great. Well, I pull on my Navajo traditions which we have a belief system that in every person, like your right side is your peace way and your left side is your war way. And in life, the goal in life is to have those be in balance, not to have just everything be peaceful, because that's not the human condition. And so I see kind of where we're at a time where even in this country, we're in the war way right now. There's a lot of instability and angst and distrust, and then with climate, we're seeing that like Mother Earth is not in balance right now. And so I kind of think about it that way, because like when I was serving at the Interior Department, in that role as solicitor, something, you know, I never imagined I'd be doing. And it was a very tough job. I was talking with a medicine man and who had came to visit me because he was in town for meetings, you know, like on the Hill or something. And he said, because, you know, I said, this is really tough. And he was like, well, you don't get your peace way unless you have war way. Like you cannot get to peace and that sense of harmony unless you have these hard times and struggles in life. And so that's kind of how I'm viewing where we're at right now, like that there will be a new chapter on the horizon that is more in balance. That is where we find our way. And so that gives me hope. I also think with the youth, I have 2 daughters, you know, they give me hope. The next generation that's coming after us. And I know we're not leaving them with the best of conditions, but they also give me hope, because they will learn from us and do better. So.
Oh, thank you both for such inspiring comments and such an instructive dialogue that we had for the last hour and 20 minutes or so. It's been very helpful, and just a reminder that many people on this call today in the audience do this work because they do have a sense of urgency. They have the fight within them, but they also have hope and a desire that the next generations, or the current generation, of course, the next generation has better outcomes and a more peaceful, sustainable, balanced life and world. Thank you for that. And I'd like to thank the National Academies for this opportunity, the president who spearheaded the Climate Crossroads initiative and is obviously the sponsor of this important talk on environmental justice. Thank you, and I'd like to head it back to staff.
Thank you, Michael, for moderating such an important conversation, and a huge thanks to Patty and Hillary for the impactful work you're doing and for the insights and contributions to our convo today. A big thanks to everyone who joined us today. Thank you for your interest and your excellent questions. We had so many on the background here. The conversation was recorded and will be available to view on the same webpage immediately after we end. I would also like to thank all of the National Academy staff who supported today's event behind the scenes, to Jasmine Bryant, Catherine Wise, and John Holmes from the National Academy's Board on Energy and Environmental Systems for their contributions to today's event. Finally, I would love to give a huge shout out to our fantastic collaborators, Carson Bullock and Leo Curran at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, who really made today's conversation possible. Our next climate conversation will be at the same time on May 31st and discuss the mental health and well-being impacts of community-driven relocation. The registration is open and can be accessed through the series landing page under upcoming events. So head over there to learn more and sign up. Be sure to also subscribe to our weekly newsletter so you don't miss any of the climate events happening at the National Academies. If you'd like to share feedback on today's event or ideas for future events, please take our survey. Thank you all again for joining, and we'll see you next month.